Start recording. Okay. I want to start actually. I don't know whether who, I can't tell yet who's on, but there was a question that was raised. Oh, I wish I remember who asked this question. Yes, last week. We were talking about Binyamin and Yosef's reunion and the crying, and Rashi's comment, it was actually quoting a midrash, as you recall, that there seems to be a change in the language, which is unusual, and Rashi says that Binyamin cried and Yosef cried. They were crying over each other's shoulder because of the destruction of the future temples. And someone asked a question, I think it was Jewel at the end of the Shiur, I think so, about the language of that Yaakov was crying when he reunited with Yosef, and it seems to be the same, and why is it a different interpretation there? At any point, at the end of the lesson, I had suggested that the language was singular, and one of my colleagues who was on the Shiur last week, I don't know if she's on yet, her name is Leora, she pointed out that the word was also plural, wondering why then the comment did not apply in that context as well. So I did a little bit more research, and it turns out that the word, which is tzavarav, which normally would be understood in biblical Hebrew as a plural, there are precedents in Tanakh where it is singular. So I think, therefore, it is possible to say that the reason that the comment doesn't apply to Yaakov's reunion with Yosef, where he cried on his shoulder, is because there actually the word is understood in the singular. Anyways, I don't want to get too technical, but I was just fascinated by the question, so I have to do a little bit of digging, which is the best part of any Shiur, is preparing and thinking and learning and coming back. And I was happy to find that information. So let's begin our Shiur tonight. Our Shiur's Vayechi. It will be the last Parsha. It is the last Parsha in Sefer Bereshit. So we end up, I think, with a little siyum tonight, but we're going to get to that in a little while. So Parshat Vayechi takes place during the 17 years, the last 17 years of Yaakov's life. And were they the best years of his life? In some way, it seems that he himself identifies this period of his life as being particularly enjoyable. He seems to be under the generous care of his beloved son. Whatever travails seem to have followed him in sadnesses and suffering in all the years prior to that doesn't seem to be part of his experience. But I do want to take a look at a couple of parts of this parsha. There's some, as I've always said, it's not what I teach, it's what I have to not teach. That's the hardest part of the Shiur. And okay, I'm going to teach this year. Okay. And then have to wait. Oh, it's going to take me a whole other year to be able to talk to everybody about this. But God willing, we will be able to wait and overcome and learn. So I'm going to start with chapter 47. I'm going to start with Perek Mem Zayin. No, I'm 47:28, correct. I am starting with chapter 47, Pasuk Kaf Chet. And Pasuk Kaf Chet is the very first Pasuk in Sefer Vayechi. By the way, Vayechi is distinguished in a lot of ways. One of them, of course, it's the last Parsha of Sefer Bereshit, but another way is if you were to take a look at a Sefer Torah, each Parsha sort of is indicated, oh, here's a new Parsha, line, there's a space. How it is typically spaced out so that even in a optical way, it indicates that it's a new section. However, when you look in the Sefer Torah, the beginning of this parsha is just in the middle of a sentence. There's absolutely no indication, none, zero, that a new parsha is starting. It's just one word right after the other, and the beginning of Vayechi, just in the middle of the line. And this catches the attention of our Chachamim, and it catches the attention of Rashi. And so Rashi begins his comment to Parshat Vayechi with the question, Lama Parsha zo situma? why is this parsha closed? Meaning, why does it not have that traditional anticipated space that precedes the beginning of a new parsha? It's closed. There is no space. The last word of the last parsha, and right after, it's the beginning of Parshat Vayechi. Why is it closed? And his answer is this: because once Yaakov, our forefather, died, which takes place in Parshat Vayechi, Nistemu inehem b'libam shel Yisrael mi tzarat Hashavua, which essentially means that because that he dies, the eyes and hearts of the Jewish people were closed. And why was that? Because of the sense of hopelessness and despair that overcame them with the onset of the Egyptian slavery and bondage. I'll read it one more time in Hebrew. Because Yaakov passes away, dies in this parsha, the heart and eyes of the Jewish people were closed, mitzarat Hashavua, from the beginning of the slavery, shitchilu l'shabda, because Egypt began to enslave the Jewish people. So I haven't finished Sefer Breshit, but I know that all of us have been through this rodeo before. So we know how Sefer Breshit ends, and we certainly know how Sefer Shemot begins. The slavery hasn't begun yet. Yosef is still alive. The Jewish nation is not yet even transformed itself into a nation. It's still sort of like this large family living in Egypt. So why does Rashi, at the very onset, the very beginning of Parshat Vayechi, why is he already telling us about the beginning of the enslavement? It's not chronologically correct. So I want to share with you what I think is an interesting explanation, and one that in some ways, as I keep saying all the time, challenges us, because it's not really about just this part of time. It's about us. It's about now. So this explanation is authored by Rabbi Shimon Schwab. Rabbi Shimon Schwab wrote his ideas, his little thoughts on the Torah in a collection called Ma'ayan Beit HaShoeva. Rabbi Schwab was a student of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, made his way to New York, and became the rabbi in Washington Heights of the sort of German community, the Breuer's Community Shul in Washington Heights. And so in his collection of ideas on the Torah called Ma'ayan Beit HaShoeva, he offers a really interesting idea. So he says, in order to answer the question, why does Rashi begin or think, or why do our rabbinic tradition believe that the enslavement begins here and not later on in the next Chumash in Sefer Shemot? He says, just think a little bit further ahead in this parsha. And just prior to Yaakov passing away, he has a small, intimate conversation with Yosef. And I'm going to just turn to it for a minute. And I'm going to turn to chapter 49. You don't have to follow, but if you want to, you certainly are welcome to. And I'm going to go to chapter 49, and I'm going to be reading from Pasuk 4. No, actually, that's not the one I want. I apologize. Yaakov Avinu is having a discussion with his son. And at the beginning of Parshat Vayechi, one of the key places, he turns to Yaakov and Yaakov turns to Yosef. And he says, I don't want to be buried in Mitzrayim. I want to be buried in Marat Machpelah, back in Eretz Canaan, Israel, with my family. And then he says to them following, I want you to swear. I want you to swear to me, Vayomer Hish Avali, swear to me that you're going to fulfill my wishes. Swear to me, Vayish Avalo, and Yosef swears to his father. So when you make a person take an oath, usually the reason that you ask a person to take an oath is because you believe that you need to somehow make certain that the request is going to be fulfilled. When you just ask a person and they say, okay, while it's a person's word is often very convincing, an oath brings with it not only a emotional sense of obligation, but it's even a legal sense of obligation. Taking an oath within Jewish law carries with it some additional level of seriousness and obligation. I might not keep my word, but I'm for sure going to keep my oath because I've sworn using God's name. I've taken an oath. Why does Yaakov force Yosef to take an oath? It's his son. It's beloved son. They loved each other. The reunion was tearful, was joyful. Why is it that Yosef's word, okay, Abba, I'll do what you ask. I'll take you to Eretz Canaan. I'll bury you there in Marat Machpelah. Why is that not enough? Interesting. Rabbi Schwab suggests that that piece of information is critical in understanding why it is that our Chachamim believed that the enslavement started actually in this Parsha and not in Sefer Shemot. It is because Yosef took an oath that Paro seems to be more inclined to allow Yosef and his family to take his father out of Egypt, which is where he ought to have been buried, because that's where he passed away, and go back to Eretz Canaan. But not just only Yaakov, even Yosef. And as we're going to see later, there was this huge entourage of Egyptian dignitaries and soldiers that accompanied the brothers, Yosef included, and the body of Yaakov all the way back to Eretz Canaan. But the oath part, says Rabbi Schwab, that was a strategic decision that Yaakov did. Not because he didn't trust Yosef, not at all. He trusted his son. But he was trying to make a strategic decision that ultimately would convince whom? Paro. It was Paro that Yaakov had in mind, not his son. Because if Yosef had to go to the monarch and say, I took an oath as a son to obey my father, then that already carries with it some sort of different element, psychological element, that is likely to convince somebody who might be reluctant to agree. That's a piece of information that might just sway a person's decision one way or the other. And Yaakov knew that it was likely, or possible at least, for Yosef to find himself in an awkward or difficult situation to get Paro's permission to go ahead and to take his family back to Eretz Canaan and to bury his father there. So not only that, interestingly enough, Rabbi Schwab says, just look carefully at the text. The text of Yaakov, of what happens when Yaakov passes away. So Yaakov passes away, and now I'm reading from chapter 50, and they embalm him because that's one, what Egyptians did, but two, they are taking a corpse in the hot Middle East sun from Egypt to Israel, and they needed to make sure that nothing inappropriate would happen to the body. So according to the Torah, he was embalmed. And he was embalmed for 40 days because that's the process. Huge mourning and crying in all of Egypt for 40 days, and then another 70 days, 40. And so now it's already 110 days since Yaakov passed away, and he still hasn't been taken back to Eretz Canaan. Now the embalming becomes even more clear and understandable in the hot climate of the Middle East. And now that that period is over, I'm reading Pasuk Dalet, Hebrew then English. Vayavru yamei v'chito vayedaber Yosef el beit Paro lemor imna matzati chen be'inechem dabruna ve'oznei Paro lemor. Listen to this language. I'm going to read it now in English. When his bewailing period passed, the mourning period, Yosef spoke to Paro's household, saying, if you please, if I have found favor in your eyes, speak now in the ears of Paro, saying, my father had adjured me, my father had made me swear, behold, I'm about to die in my grave, which I have hewn for myself. Behold, am I about to die. In my grave, which I have hewn for myself in the land of Canaan, there you are to bury me. Now I will go up, if you please, and bury my father, then I will return. Okay. I don't know if you picked this up as I was reading it. I was hoping you did. Who's Yaakov asking this favor of? If your answer is Paro, your answer is wrong. I'll read it again. Hebrew, then English. Vaydaber Yosef el Beit Paro lemor. Yosef spoke to Paro's household, saying, Imna matzatichen be'einechem dabruna be'oznei Paro. If I have found favor in your eyes, speak now in the ears of Paro for me. What? What's going on here? How do you now think of Yosef? Wasn't he the second in command? Wasn't this the guy that Paro said, nothing is going to be held back from you? You are like me, except that I'm the king and you're not, but everything else is in your hands? What's happened? What has happened? And Rabbi Schwab says, you can't controvert what the words are written in the Torah. And what are the words telling you? The words are telling you that Yosef couldn't even have direct access to Paro anymore. He had to go to the household of Paro. He had to go through sort of like a hierarchy. He had to go through I'll have my people speak to your people. I'll speak to your people and see if you can do something. Please, on my behalf, go and talk. That's not the way the second in command speaks. You should be able to pick up the phone and say, boss, I need to have a conversation with you. And that's how the level of conversation should have happened. But it didn't. And why didn't it happen? Rabbi Schwab says it didn't happen because something has definitely changed. And what is that? That Yosef is no longer the Yosef that we knew. Meaning, he's not such a hot, important guy anymore. That whereas at the beginning of the Yosef story, he now ascends this ladder of importance. By the time we get to Parshat Vayechi, at this point in Vayechi, right after Yaakov's passing, the Torah is giving me a little glimpse of some sort of change that's already happening in Egypt. And the change is happening to Yosef Atzadik. He doesn't seem to be the wonderkind anymore. He doesn't seem to be the beloved Yosef that everybody is thanking for saving. He doesn't seem to be the master planner who had this idea of how he's going to pull Mitzrayim out of the 7 years of famine and still make sure that people don't die. He doesn't. We don't hear him as the architect of making Egypt the superpower in the entire region that people from all over are coming to somehow subjugate themselves or buy food at probably fairly significant prices. So says Rabbi Schwab, it seems that Yosef is already demoted from his prestigious position in Egypt. He's no longer held in this huge viceroy position. And Bnei Israel's diplomatic immunity, so to speak, is no longer assured. He needs to really plead with Paro. And Yaakov, of course, understanding that this might, or in fact has already happened, maybe Yaakov was a little prescient and he understood that this was going on. That's why he told him, you better swear. You better swear, because that element of obligation may be the fact that it's going to make Paro agree to the terms that I want you to fulfill for me, to bury me in Marat Machpelah. So according to this, the onset of slavery doesn't happen in Sefer Shemot. It starts right here. It starts right here. The effects are right here in Parshat Vayechi, when Yosef appears no longer to occupy that important post in Eretz Mitzrayim. And he says, the closing of the eyes and the heart that I quoted to you, I read for you in Rashi, that's in some ways a metaphor. Oh, a metaphor for what? A metaphor for what? So it's not a metaphor for the suffering that's going to happen because of Egypt. But when your eyes and heart are closed, it also means that you are not open to receiving information. You are not open to perceiving the world around you as it is unfolding. And Rabbi Schwab says that the slavery began at the time that the Jewish people were not prepared or unable, or maybe even better, unwilling to read the sign of the times. To read the sign of the times. If Yosef was not the beloved wonder boy of Egypt, then things had changed, and they're not going to get better. Read the sign on the walls. Read the graffiti. Read the signs. Read what people are saying. And one has to wonder, and I'm going to connect this to something else. One of the questions that always is asked about the Yosef story, it's asked not on this parsha, but earlier, is why did Yosef not write home? Why did he never send a message? Why did he never connect with his father to tell him after 22 years he was okay? He didn't do that. There's so many answers to this. But one answer, particularly, might in fact be connected to Rabbi Schwab, at least Rabbi Schwab's understanding of this whole episode of the swearing of the oath and the burial and speak for me to Paro, please. One of the reasons that's suggested why Yosef never wrote home is because it was dangerous for Yosef. Don't forget, the Yosef story is the story of an immigrant, because he's not an Egyptian, and he never identified himself as an Egyptian. He openly declared that he was a Hebrew slave. He even named his kids in the names of, I remember where I'm from, Menashe is a name that indicates his ongoing memory of his youth, of his home, of his youth. Menashe, his eldest, was there, as it were, as a reminder that he is an immigrant, that his place is Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, that is fluent Egyptian as he might speak, and as handsome as he was, and dressed in the finest clothing and cloth, he wasn't an Egyptian. And there very likely was a segment of the Egyptian population, maybe even in the house of Paro, who were not happy with Yosef, who thought that he was a threat. They thought he was an outsider. And Yosef's lack of connecting or reaching out to his father in Eretz Canaan might not have been because of some sort of divine idea waiting for his dream to come true, might not have been because he wasn't sure of his position in the family. It could have been something more maybe political, that he wasn't sure of his position. And had he begun those lines and opened those channels of communication with family living in Eretz Canaan, maybe he was going to be accused of some sort of treason or lack of loyalty to the king and to Egypt. And it is possible that maybe that's what we're seeing here. Rabbi Schwab is not saying this directly, but I'm trying to extrapolate that there came a period of time where Yosef was no longer venerated the way he once was. Because after all, he pulled them through, and we all forget. We all have short memories. So at some point, people are saying, life is good, we're back to normal. The markets are full, the stores are flowing with merchandise. People are in the markets, and Yorkdale is full, and nobody, oh my gosh, can't wait to get back to the cinema, get back to the arenas, let's watch the games. Joseph? I remember that, but you know what, let's watch the next period and have a hamburger. So they weren't paying attention anymore to Yosef. So that might be one of the explanations. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is not about Egypt. It's about anybody. It's about us, not just us, but seeing the signs and looking and understanding what we need to know from the writing on the wall, as it were. And there are lots of different ways. Now, I know it's not an imperfect science, but I don't know. Sometimes I see things and I wonder, where are we going with this? It doesn't sound good. It doesn't feel good. Especially, I guess, for those who are mothers and fathers, anybody who has children or grandchildren or on university campuses, certainly in Toronto, the amount of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel bias that seems to be growing across North America. Is that what's going on here? Is Yosef and his contemporaries not seeing something there? Are we not seeing? I don't know. But I raise it as one of the possible messages from this part of the Parshat. I'm going to go ahead. In chapter 48, amongst the conversations that Yaakov has with Yosef and his sons, Menashe and Ephraim and Menashe, in chapter 48, Pasuk Zayin, Yaakov says to Yosef, I want you to know that I am giving you the birthright. You are now going to be the Bechor of the family. That's an extraordinary move, not one without consequence. Vayomer Eli, Pasuk 5, Shnei banecha hanoladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim adu lecha Mitzrayim liheim. the children that you gave birth to before I came to meet you here in Egypt, Menashe and Ephraim, they are mine. They are mine. They're like Reuven and Shimon. They are like my own children. What does that mean? And a lot of the Mefarshim say what Yaakov is trying to tell Yosef is they are like my own children. So since the children that I personally gave birth to, the 12 children, are going to be the inheritors, they are going to be the Shvatim. They are going to be the ones to inherit the portion of the land of Israel at some point in the future. I want your two sons, Menashe and Ephraim, to be inheritors in the land of Israel. Now that's a bold move. Why? Because they came from Yosef. Now Yosef is a direct son of Yaakov. That's clear. So Yosef should get one portion of the land. And Yaakov says, no, that's not the way I want to work it. I want you to have your family, your sons, to have two portions. Now, who would automatically get two portions? That's the Bechor. That's the halakha. The Bechor gets twice of what everybody else gets. And so what Yaakov is essentially saying to Yosef is, I am now transferring the status of Bechor to you. Thereby, I'm taking it away from Reuven. I'm giving it to you, to your sons. And as he says that to him, as he says this to Yosef, the Torah says in Pasuk Zayin, Vani b'boim mivadan meta alai Rachel. But as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died. He's talking about on the way back from Laban's house before he got to Israel. On my way back from Padan, Rachel died on me in the land of Canaan on the road, while there was still a stretch of land to go to Ephrat. I was on my way. I was on my way to Ephrat, but I couldn't make it. She passed away on the road. And so what did I do? I buried her there on the way to Beit Lechem. I buried her. She did not get buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah. So one of the things that's a little bit unclear is what's triggering this particular part of Yaakov's conversation with Yosef. I'm taking your sons. I want to give them part of the land of Israel. I'm giving you this blessing of, as it were, being the newly appointed Bechor of the family. I'm taking it away from Reuven, Leah's son, and I'm giving it to you, Rachel's son, and to your children. They will be inheritors of the land of Israel. But why? Why is he doing that here? This is not the first time that Yaakov and Yosef are talking, but somehow Yaakov seems to be holding back this little reminder about the family history. He's holding that back for here when he's talking about giving Menashe and Ephraim their own portions in the land of Israel. So why do that? So many of the commentaries suggest that Yaakov was anticipating what Yosef was going to say, meaning, but wait a second. Yosef could say, Father, you want me to swear to you that I'm going to take you and I'm going to take you back to the land of Canaan, and I should bury you in Me'arat HaMachpelah. You want that for me, right? But you didn't do that for Mom, did you? No, you couldn't bury her. You just put her in the middle of the road. Well, I don't mean middle of the road. You buried her on the way in a dignified manner, correct. But you didn't take her back to Me'arat HaMachpelah for that eternal resting place of our family. You didn't do that for her. So perhaps Yaakov is feeling guilty about what he didn't do for his wife, for Yosef's mother. And so at the very time that he's speaking about getting buried and what he's going to be doing for the family, he wants Yosef to understand. He wants Yosef to understand that what he did for Rachel, he did because he may not have had any choice, or, and this I think is maybe even a more convincing argument, don't think Yaakov is trying to tell Yosef that I didn't respect and love your mother. I did. And it's because I loved her so much that I'm doing what I'm doing for you. I don't want you to ever think that the way in which I treated her after her passing is an indication of how my love and what I felt for her. I don't want you to think that I thought of her as an inferior status as my wife. Leah, of course, is buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah, but your mom is not. So one might think that perhaps you thought that that was a treatment or a inappropriate way of showing my love and respect for your mother. He says, no, that's not it. And to show you that that's not it, I want to do something very, very bold to show you that I really respected and I want your mother's legacy to be enshrined forever in the heart of the Jewish people. And that's why I'm making your two sons inheritors in the land. You are my beloved wife Rachel's son, and obviously Menashe and Ephraim are her grandchildren. And so I'm doing that so you will not think that somehow I've mistreated your mother. That's maybe one of the most convincing arguments that's possible, that why Yaakov did that. So it's possible that that's one of the explanations, but you're beginning to see again, and we've seen this all through Sefer Bereshit. It's a story of a family, and it's a story of our holy fathers, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and our mothers, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. But it's also a story of people, as though, and clearly these are not just common folk. I know that, and I'm not trying to just draw Yaakov as the simple guy on the street that we would meet going to Yorkdale. He's not. He's a man of extraordinary, not only brilliance, but spiritual power and connection to God. But still, he is a person, and he is influenced by some of the things that influence us. Worry about our relationships. What are our kids going to think? How do I demonstrate my loyalty and my love and my respect? What steps do I need to do to show that? What evidence is there going to be that my relationships are what I say that they were? So Yaakov seems to perhaps to be worried about that for himself. And notwithstanding whatever he may say, he felt that he might have to do something to concrete in order to prove the things that he was feeling about Rachel. Okay, let's go on a little bit more. Thinking about this moment where Yaakov makes this bold decision to give Yosef and his two sons their separate inheritances in the land of Israel. As he's doing this, and he's making these statements, he says about the story about Rachel buying and burying him there. And then right after that, he says, Vayar Yisrael et b'nei Yosef. He sees the sons of Yosef standing there, and he turns to Yosef and he says, Mi Elad. Who are these? Who are these people standing here? And Yosef answers, Banayim, they're my sons. Asher natan li Elokim bazeh. They're my sons that God blessed me with here in Israel, in Egypt. They're my sons. So let's just think for a second. Does that question sound odd? Yaakov asking Yosef, who are they? Who are they? Yaakov doesn't know who they are. He obviously saw somebody standing there because he was aware enough to say, who are these people? But what does he mean, who are they? According to the Chachamim, for the last 17 years, he was learning every single day with Ephraim. That Ephraim spent all of this time in Egypt learning constantly with his grandfather. Menashe spending less time because he was more likely helping his father, Yosef, run the country. But they had interactions with each other, for sure. They were dealing with each other. So for Yaakov to turn to Yosef and to say, who are they? Sounds like a very odd question. Like, he certainly knew that. So what was that about? So according to the Midrash, this is a very interesting Midrash. This question, who are they, is not to be taken literally, because literally it raises a lot of questions about the flow of the text. He obviously knew who they were, so it can't be just who are they. So what was he saying? What was he asking? It's a prophetic moment. It's a prophetic moment. He had Ruach HaKodesh, and at this moment, Yaakov is asking Yosef something a little bit deeper. He's not asking about Menashe and Ephraim specifically about themselves. He's asking about Menashe and Ephraim's future. According to the Midrash, Yaakov saw in a nevuah, in a moment of Ruach HaKodesh into the future, and he saw that Menashe and Ephraim were going to have descendants who are going to be extraordinarily wicked, really evil. Yeravam and Achab and Yehu, they're going to be kings in Israel, but kings who distinguish themselves far from being loyal servants to God. Terrible kings. The Nabi talks about them in the worst possible terms. Achab is a Rasha, a truly evil man who was out. He's described as trying to suppress God's presence in the country. And these are Yaakov's descendants. There's the Alta Zeta Yaakov, who has who? He's got one of the wickedest kings as his descendant. Never. That's not yichus that you ever want. And in a moment of clarity where he saw in the future, he was sort of like shocked that this is going to be coming from his family. This is going to be part of his Yerusha. This is going to be part of what his legacy is going to be. His reputation is going to go down as being the great antecedent, the great progenitor of Yeravam, of Achab, and of Yehu. And they're all going to be coming from Ephraim and Menashe. So Rashi, in fact, says that it was at this point that the Shechina, the divine presence, that sort of Ruach HaKodesh left Yaakov, left him, and he felt it, he knew it. It's like somehow he had the unmistakable sense that that divine presence that he was comforted by, that he felt, had left him. And he's wondering what's going on here. And maybe the two boys standing next to him are not worthy of what he was planning to say to them or give to them. So he turns to him and says, Mi'ela, what's going on? Who are they? More than who are they now? Who are they going to come? Well, who are they going to be? Who's going to come from them? What's wrong here? What's deficient in them? So why now? Why specifically now is Yaakov perturbed by this and not in any other time? Remember, 17 years. This is 17 years worth of interactions. And just now, somehow he has this terrible awareness. And why is that? For Zalman Sorotskin, I quoted his commentary before, called Yoznaim Torah. He himself, an East European Jew, Holocaust survivor, moved to Israel, and wrote a wonderful commentary to the Torah with a lot of interesting insights and sometimes even social commentary. Gives us an insight into things happening in the era following the Holocaust and even before. And he suggests, Rabbi Sorotskin, Zalman Sorotskin, suggests that Yaakov's concern resulted from the fact that he just conferred upon Menashe and Ephraim this special elevated status. Like he's just appointed them to be their own independent inheritors of the land of Israel. That's a big chiddush. That's a big innovation. That shouldn't have happened. He sort of pushed them up, elevated them to a new status that no one else had. These are grandchildren who are going to be treated like children and have inheritance rights, which is not typically the way in which it works. So, unfortunate as the emergence of these descendants as Yeravam and Achab is in its own right, and that was enough to bother Yaakov clearly, it somehow took on a greater significance once Ephraim and Menashe were themselves elevated to this status. The possibility of there being some sort of stain or blemish or negative quality that emerges from Ephraim and Menashe didn't strike Yaakov. He didn't sort of connect to that possibility until after he unilaterally declared them to be like Reuven and Shimon. Menashe and Ephraim are going to be to me like Reuven and Shimon are to me. And it's at that point, the misbehavior of these two sons' descendants struck him. And Rabbi Sorotskin in his comment continues by stating Well, he makes an interesting reference to Rosh Hashanah. It's interesting. There's a certain tefillah in the Zichronot section of the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. Ma'aseh ish ufekudato, a man's actions and his is the word ufekudato, his pikudah. A man, God remembers a man's actions and his pikudah. So his actions and his pikudah. So Rav Sorotskin says that the word pikudah means appointment. Man's actions and his appointment. Hashem remembers on Rosh Hashanah, Masei ish ufekudato, person's actions and his appointment. And Rabbi Sorotskin explains that what that means is that God judges based on not only what the person's conduct is, the absolute action itself, but also his stature, and by extension, the expectations that we have of people and the positions that they occupy. What may pass for some people as excusable may not be excusable for somebody else, depending on who they are. If a person occupies a position of leadership and influence, then you expect something from him that's different. So if somebody else were to be caught or seen doing that specific action, it may not even raise an eyebrow. But if, oh my gosh, the rabbi is doing this, the president, the governor, the prime minister, the premier, the mayor, the teacher, the principal, whatever it is, there are certain expectations that we have of people's positions. And so whereas if the person, not the position, were caught doing something, it wouldn't matter. But in that position, the person's behavior assumes greater import. And so according to Rav Sorotskin, maybe that's what's going on here, is that once he told and he declared that Ephraim and Manasseh were to be given the status, he expected more from them. And of course, that was just a matter of minutes ago, but it sort of woke him up to thinking, wait a second, is this going to be a good thing? Is it going to end up well? We do have expectations of the people who are in position of influence. And who are those people and what positions they should occupy is a question that I think, oh my goodness, in modern terms, in modern times, is so significant. You just have to think about all the confirmation meetings, whether it's in the United States or even in Canada, and all these sort of times that we try to dig up dirt on somebody before we give them the position that they are going to occupy. Would you do this? And I heard you do that. And what about this action? We heard that story. Oh my gosh, and you're accused of this. So maybe Yaakov is feeling that he's just in some ways opened that door for the Jewish people. By appointing Ephraim and Manasseh to these positions, is he opening the door for the weakening of certain people in their positions and the encouragement of the community to sort of disrespect those positions because of who occupies it. I want to go further on. In chapter 49, before he dies, Yaakov collects his children and he gives them each of them a bracha. Well, I shouldn't say that. He collects them and he speaks to them individually. So very interesting enough, not everyone gets a bracha. It's true, they don't. I misspoke there, especially Shimon and Levi. And Shimon and Levi, chapter 49, verse 5 and 6, no stretch of the imagination can you possibly say they're getting a blessing. Shimon and Levi, can you just imagine the father saying this on his deathbed? You are brothers, but Chlei Hamas Mecherotehem. Their weaponry is a stolen craft. Into their conspiracy may my soul not enter with their congregation. Do not join. Wow, he's saying, I'm keeping my space. I don't want to get too close to Shimon and Levi. Why? What did they do? He has never forgiven them for what they did after the rape and the abduction and rape of Dinah. Shimon and Levi went into the town, perpetrated an hoax, convinced the males of the town to circumcise, and then on the third day following the ritual circumcision that they willingly underwent, they came in and massacred and killed everybody. And Yaakov never forgave them. Never. Until to his dying breath, he basically said to them, I'm not going to forgive you. Then he ends with these words, and I think I may have said this last year, 2 years ago. Achal came the Yaakov v'afitzem b'Yisrael. I will separate them with Jacob. I will disperse them in Israel. Meaning, I don't want them to have their own space. I don't want them to have their own nachalah. I do not want Shimon and Levi to have their own space in the land of Israel where they can collect and consolidate, because their tribal qualities are qualities which I do not want. One of the commentaries, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, makes a fascinating comment, and I'll move on after this comment. He says, Afitzem Israel, I'm going to spread them out of Israel, might sound like it's a curse, but maybe that's not a curse. Maybe there is an element of blessing in this. Maybe this is sort of like a hidden blessing. Why? Because the Jewish people need people like Levi. The Jewish people need people like Shimon. The Jewish people need sometimes, I'm going to use this word, the hotheads, the passionate Jews who say, enough is enough. Stop capitulating. Stop giving in. Where's your backbone? Stand up. Declare you're Jewish. Stand up. Fight for what you believe in. Stand up. Don't let them push you over. Stand up. And that's Shimon and Levi. That's what they brought. They brought that no one is going to push us over anymore. And Hirsch says, we need that. We need that. We don't need it concentrated in one spot, but we need it. We need those people to be all over the Jewish world, to give us the backbone that we sometimes need, to put that fight in us, because sometimes it's through that fight that we once again regain our strength and our clarity of purpose and of mission. So that's a possibility. But he then turns to Yehuda. And Yehuda, ata yoducha checha yadcha be'oref oidecha. And Yehuda, you, your brother, shall acknowledge your hand will be at your enemy's neck. Yehuda, you are the born leader of this family. Your brothers are going to bow down to you. Shtachavul lecha b'nei avicha. The children of your father are going to bow down to you. And then this famous pasuk, pasuk 10. Lo yasur shevet meYehuda u'mechokek mibein raglav, which means the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a scholar from among his descendants. The scepter, what's a scepter? Who holds scepters? Kings, monarchs hold scepters. It is from this pasuk that our Chachamim understood that all of the rightful kings to the kingdom of Israel, all of the rightful kings must be direct descendants from Shevet Yehuda. David HaMelech is a descendant from Shevet Yehuda, and kings from any other Shevet are considered to be imposters to the throne, to the crown, and do not have the divine stamp of approval. Lo yasur Shevet me Yehuda. Only from the Shevet of Yehuda can a king be rightfully, with God's favor, be appointed as king over the Jewish nation. This, according to the Rambam, is a halachically binding provision. This pasuk is the halachically binding provision of who can legally, halachically become a king. The tribe of Yehuda is granted exclusive rights to Jewish royalty, and anyone else who establishes a monarchy is doomed to destruction. Now, I want to mention a commentary that the Ramban mentions, because I think it's extremely fascinating, a little timely, because it does have a lot to do with where we are situated in the Jewish calendar. Not far from Hanukkah, and of course, as you know, tonight we concluded the fast for Hashavua Tevet, the 10th day of Tevet. So the Ramban, Rav Moshe ben Nachman, in his commentary to this pasuk, astonishingly, really, it's an amazing Ramban that if you can read it, even in the English translation, it's so worth reading. He says, what's the evidence to this? What's the historical evidence to this verse? And there is historical evidence. What's the historical evidence? So the Ramban says that he points to whom? To the Chashmonaim, the Hanukkah story. The Maccabim, the Chashmonaim, Matityahu and his 5 sons, Yochanan, Eliezer, Shimon, Yehuda. Those are the sons that he points to. What's the point to? Do you remember who they were? Yochanan, if you remember your Ala Nisim, Matityahu ben Yochanan, what the next two words? Kohen Gadol. So wait a minute. Matityahu is a Kohen Gadol. His sons are Kohanim, clearly. They led the war. They led the insurrection against Greece, and they kicked out Antiochus. But then what happened? We stopped telling the story, usually at Hanukkah. But the story gets told in history. We know that. The Gemara talks about this as well as good as history. What happened to the Hashmonaim? The Hashmonaim, a family of Kohanim, who reinstated the service in the Beit HaMikdash 100%, and they revived Jewish tradition. And many of the Meforshim say we have to credit the Hashmonaim for saving Judaism. It was that close for the eradication of Jewish life in Israel. That close. So many Jews became Hellenists and were completely prepared to throw away their Jewish life completely, ad kedei kach, to the point that men were trying to figure out how to undo their circumcisions. That's how widespread the anti-Jewish sentiment was amongst Jews. So we got to give them credit. However, the Rambam emphasizes, and his story in his halachot dealing with Chanukah, he emphasizes that the Hashmonaim, while deserving credit, they also violated halacha. How so? Because they took on kingdom. After the war, it became the Hashmonaim, from the family of the Hashmonaim, who assumed the monarchy in Israel. Is that a problem? Yes, because they don't come from Shevet Yehuda. If you're Kohanim, you can only come from Shevet Levi. And they, however, wrongfully took upon themselves to become kings of Israel until Rome defeated them and wiped them out. And there's no more Hashmonaim. They're gone. They're gone from the stage of Jewish history. They're there to help and regain Jewish control and sovereignty over the land of Israel. And then for about 200 years, they occupied the kingdom of Israel. But then when Rome came, they were completely wiped out. Why were they wiped out? Because they had committed a sin. What was the sin? A violation of this halacha, which originates as a blessing or prophetic blessing. Lo yasur shevet miyuda, that the kingdom, the rightful heirs, the rightful kings of Israel must come from Shevet Yehuda. And sadly, the victory of the Hashmonaim did not last. So if on Hanukkah we celebrate the Hashmonaim's triumph, this particular Shabbos, which is Shabbos Parshat Vayechi, we're reminded of their collapse. We're reminded of their collapse. That's what Ramban is telling us. Ramban wants us to know that Hanukkah's over, a few weeks behind us, and we were celebrating in dreidels and latkes and singing and hallel and beautiful parties, amazing. Thank God for the Hashmonaim. Just a few weeks later, the Ramban says, now go to chapter 2 of the story. Chapter 2 is not so praiseworthy. They did the wrong thing, and they disappeared. An opportunity that we had seems to be tragically lost. And it's so interesting, because today, as I mentioned a second ago, of course, we concluded the fast of Asara B'Tevet. And Asara B'Tevet is a day that commemorates the beginning of the Babylonian siege of Yerushalayim, which lasted for about a year and a half until the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. And so why do we commemorate this event that led up to the destruction? So, why are the steps along the way to the Churban important? Why don't we just have the fast of Tisha B'Av, which is the day of the Churban? But that's not enough. I need Asara B'Tevet, and then we're going to have Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Why isn't Tisha B'Av itself just sufficient for this? And maybe, perhaps, what we are commemorating is not the siege. Today is not commemorating the siege, but it's commemorating a warning signal. And what's the warning signal? It was the warning signal that didn't get heard. It didn't get heard. That it fell on deaf ears. The prophet Yirmiyahu at his time was prophesying in the name of Hashem, pleading with the kings of Judea to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar. Don't go up against Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. Don't do it. The Babylonian Empire, but submit to him. And that was what the Navi said. Don't fight Nebuchadnezzar. Submit, surrender to the king. And God had decided, according to the way we see history, the rabbinic way of seeing history, God had decided in an irrevocable decision that he was granting the Babylonian Empire with Nebuchadnezzar as its head 70 years of power and control over the land of Israel. But the last three kings, Jehoiakim, and Tzidkiyahu, completely disobeyed Yirmiyahu. They accused the Navi of sedition. What, God, you're telling us to give in to our enemy? That's sedition, that's treason. And they continued. They rejected what the Navi said, and they continued their hopeless resistance. And the final siege in Yerushalayim had served as a warning to the king Tzidkiyahu and affirmed the Navi's position. It's over, it's finished. You guys are gone, your history. Why are you fighting this? So when we have a fast on a Sarah B'Tevet, we're committing ourselves in some ways, not just to remembering a historical moment, which is the beginning of the siege against Yerushalayim, but we're also trying to recall the mistakes that ancestors made, who let an opportunity slip by not obeying the warning signals sent by God. And so the Rambam, in his Hilchos Tshuva, he says that tragedy and crisis should bring on a period of tshuva. That's what any fast is, a period of tshuva. So what's this happening? What am I supposed to do on a fast besides not eat and just wonder, when's it over? When's it over? Oh my God, another minute? Okay. That's not the purpose of the fast. It never was the purpose of the fast. Not eating was a way of sort of forcing us to focus our attention on other things, and hopefully to tshuva, to davening, to think of for a minute, what are the messages that we learn from history? What opportunities that we have? And so the Hashmonaim had an amazing opportunity. They regained the security of the sovereign state of Israel, but they missed it. And when the warnings came from the Navi years later, this is not the right way to go, they said, don't listen, it's not right. So maybe that's the purpose of the fast. It's Parshat Vayechi is situated so interestingly right after Hanukkah, and now we're right today where it's Tish, the Aseret B'Tevet is over. Parshat Vayechi is here. We began with the idea that maybe the messages that we need to listen to are the messages all around us. And sometimes we get so caught up in the moment that we forget to stop. And that's what a fast day is. Stop. Just stop for a second. Stop. Take an extra davening. Take an extra moment. Don't eat. Just step out of the box and just think. Is there anything that we need to consider that we could change to make things better so that we don't miss the messages? Sometimes the messages are personal. Sometimes they're familial. Sometimes they are messages as a community, like a synagogue. Sometimes they're of a city, and sometimes they're national. But learning Chumash, I really do believe, is one of the ways that we sensitize ourselves again to those messages. And that's why Parshat, I think, is such an amazing opportunity every week to think again about a new message, a new idea. And so this ends Sefer Breshit, Chazak, Chazak, B'ni Chazek. So I'm going to ask you to do something with me. This is a siyum. So I came prepared. Go get something to drink. I don't care what. You want to have a glass of water, juice, want something? Let's drink a l'chaim together. Let's drink a l'chaim for all of us, having learned all of Sefer Breshit together, having come this far, having learned together, thought together, felt together, questioned together, maybe found some answers together. And let's drink a l'chaim. I don't care where you go. It doesn't have to be this. I'm going to take a little bit of single malt. And we'll hopefully, no, I'm serious. Get up from your chair. Go get something to drink. Let's drink a l'chaim together. I'm not kidding here. This is serious. Thank you. Let's go. This is an accomplishment. We're having a siyum. We learned Sefer Breshit. Come on, you got to drink a l'chaim. This is an accomplishment, my friends. It's a simcha. we've done something wonderful. So whatever it is you're drinking, L'chaim Torah L'Shalom, may Hashem give each and every one of us the energy to continue learning Torah. May He give us the health that we can do this together or individually. Mirz Hashem will be able to learn together, maybe around a big table. If it's not around a big table in Toronto, maybe it should be around a big table in the Beit HaMikdash. It should be built with being Hey Rabbi Yameinu. I want to wish each of you a Yishar Kol Chachem. Be strong. Do not give up. Next week, we'll be starting Sefer Shmot together. And Mirz Hashem, at the conclusion of Sefer Shmot, we'll continue to drink another l'chaim and make our way. This started after Simchas Torah. Breshit is right after Simchas Torah. And here we are after Hanukkah. Yehi Ratzon, may Hashem give each and every one of us arichat yamim v'shonim, the wisdom to know how to make our days as full as possible in the proper service of Hashem, to be better Jews, to be better friends, to be better community members, to be better global citizens. L'chaim tovim u'l'sholom, my friends. Baruch atah Adonai.
Amen. Amen. Yes.
Amen. I hope you're drinking something you enjoy. L'chaim. L'chaim.
L'chaim, Rabbi.
Excellent.
Never drink anything that I don't enjoy.
Pardon?
I never drink anything that I don't enjoy.
Oh, good. Excellent.
I love that.
Barbara, did you want to say something?
I enjoy every minute of it, Rabbi Diamond. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Marika.
Thank you.
Barbara, please.
Ottawa's warning Canadians against non-essential travel. Kenny?
Barbara, I'm not sure, but I'm not hearing you. Is it me or I'm not? I don't hear your voice. I see you're speaking, but I don't hear the sound.
Press Alt A. If you
They're
press
on mute.
Alt A, yeah, there you are, Barbara.
I know you're speaking, Barbara, but for whatever reason, it's not coming through on my laptop. I'm sorry. I don't know if others are having the same challenge as I am.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Okay.
It's Eleanor Mintz. So throughout this chapter, the last one, you know, and maybe you've discussed this and I missed it, so sorry about that. But Yaakov and Yisrael, they switch names all the time, and sometimes in the same sentence.
Yeah.
Have you anything to say about that, or? You know, has anyone done an analysis of it?
Good question.
The name Yisrael, as the Chumash, in fact, indicates to us when that name was bestowed upon Yaakov after his struggle with the angel. It comes from the word struggle, so it usually refers to some sort of higher level of existence of the Jewish people. Yaakov often refers to the character, or I don't want to use the word character, the personality, Yaakov, the individual in the Chumash. Yisrael is often seen as having qualities that go beyond him, but are, you know, almost national, almost spiritual at a different level. So that's one of the reasons that those names tend to be used. And there usually is an indication, usually is a meaning that goes beyond just the person when Hashem. The Torah uses the name Yisrael, not just Yaakov.
Do you know of anyone that's done an analysis of because they're often in one sentence, you can get both.
Yeah, it's true that they sometimes are in do I know of an essay or analysis? Let me think about that, Eleanor.
Okay.
See if in Hebrew or English. I mean, I've seen things sometimes in Hebrew, but I'm going to see if I can find something in English.
And I have a comment to make.
Okay, please share.
So, you know, in the story of Judah and Tamar, Tamar gives birth to twins.
Yeah.
And it's a neat little bookends, because Judah's lost his two sons. She gives birth to two sons.
Yes.
And it's just a neat little way of it's like beautifully done. I think the book ending there. It just occurred to me with Manasseh and Ephraim being elevated. Well, Yaakov has not elevated, I don't know what the word would be, diminished, demoted his sons Shimon and Levi. And at the other end, you get the elevation of Menashe and Ephraim. And I thought that was quite nice, a nice fit.
It is a nice fit. You know, I see that, I think, Barbara, this is your question you put in the chat in terms of why do we use Menashe and Ephraim as the source of bracha when we bench our kids on Friday night. So one of the answers it's given, and you can understand this, as I said, if you remember the drama of the family of Yaakov, is Menashe and Ephraim are the only sets of siblings, certainly in Sefer Bereshit, that are described as getting along with each other. Meaning that there's love. I mean, you can just imagine the scene where Menashe is fully expecting to somehow get some special blessing from his grandfather because he's the oldest. And his grandfather goes like this. Yaakov, crosses his hands, puts his right hand over Ephraim. And what's Menashe's response? Nothing. He's okay with it. There's nothing ever mentioned that Menashe and Ephraim stop getting along. And it becomes almost like the paradigm we're blessing our children that they should have what Menashe and Ephraim had, which is this lifelong love and accord with their siblings. And you think about Yaakov, oh my gosh, he certainly did not have that with him. And then look at his own family and how it was so fractured that to give his grandchildren a bracha, please, everybody, have children like Menashe and Ephraim, because so much trouble came from what happened in my family. I understand that bracha now, boy. I really do. And then I see that Selma says, I believe the concern was about their children. We bless our sons with their names. They had a close relationship, which is what we hope. Yes, exactly. I think I said what you just intended, Selma. Thank you. Thank you. It's a beautiful, I give you a beautiful explanation. Amazing. This is one of my favorite Divrei Torah on all the Sefer Bereshit. So I just said a second ago in answering Barbara that when Yaakov blessed Menashe and Ephraim, he did like this, right? So the way Yosef had set up the boys, he set up the boys right opposite Yaakov. So which meant that Yosef's vision was Yaakov was going to put his right hand on Menashe's head, and he was going to put his left hand on Ephraim's head. So it's going to look like this, right? Perfect. Now, why didn't Yaakov ask Yosef, can you please move the boys over and why did he switch the boys? Why did he go like this? Wouldn't it have been easier just to, okay, no. I want Ephraim on this side and Menashe on that side. Why didn't he do that? Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky has a beautiful Dvar Torah. He says, you have to understand something about the two boys. As I said a minute ago, actually it's no longer a minute ago. As I said before, Ephraim had spent all his time studying Torah with his grandfather, with Yaakov. Perfect. And what was Menashe doing? Menashe was busy in the business of running a state. He was helping his father in being a statesman and a politician and running a country in government. He was out there involved in the world, whereas Ephraim was studying Torah. Had Yaakov blessed the two boys by putting his hands like this, he would have ultimately created two parallel lines. That's what his hands would have formed, right? Two parallel lines.
Okay.
Yaakov did not want that because he felt that symbolically the implied message would be that those two areas of enterprise, being engaged in the world and studying Torah, never meet. They're two parallel lines. So therefore, instead of moving the boys and this way, he crossed his hands, because when you cross your hands, those lines must intersect. And the message, he says, is that's the message that we as Jews are blessing our children and saying, find the way for the intersection. Find the way to maintain your commitment to Torah and its centrality while still being engaged in the world. That's why Yaakov deliberately crossed his hands to create that place of intersection. Is that not a beautiful idea? I think that's,
Rabbi?
I think that's just
Rabbi?
beautiful.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Rabbi, I don't, sorry, Marty's coughing. I don't mean to be irreverent or impudent, but seriously, what Torah was he studying?
Oh, really? So first of all, remember that there'd be two answers to that question. So number one, the Torah, we're not talking about necessarily the Aseret HaDibrot. At one answer, there was the Torah about understanding about God and what God wants from us. And that was Torah that came from Yeshiva Shem and Aver. And we've talked about those two as being teachers of their generations, whom Yaakov had studied with about the existence of God. And don't also forget that Yaakov also had learned from his grandfather, Avraham, about his role of bringing the understanding of ethical monotheism into the world. So there was a lot of teaching that existed. That's answering the question.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
So that's answering the question that way, Sharon. Now there's another way of answering the question, and that is based on the Gemara that says that while the actual Torah, qua Torah, did not come into existence, did not come into the consciousness of the Jewish people, it's a better way of saying it, until Har Sinai, our forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, because of their very, very
Right.
spiritual nature, had somehow intuited much of what was involved in the Torah. And that intuitive knowledge is what they taught their children and grandchildren.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Sharon Bowman, yes,
Yeah.
You're muted, Sharon. Sharon, you got to unmute.
Yeah,
Can
I'm
you hear
here.
me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, I can.
Okay. Working backwards, when you think of the Egyptians' concern about the Jews being strong and powerful, Havani Chakma Lahem Pen Yerbu, and further backwards from that, Yosef losing favor in the eyes of Pharaoh, his strength diminishing, and the whole concept of anti-Semitism that we're so heavily experiencing now. Evidently in Egypt, there was hatred of the Jews early on. I think I may have copied you an article that Rabbi Blansky wrote about very early on earlier on, when Yosef had his family at a family dinner, when they had all made up and at the palace, they all had a banquet, a lovely meal. Rabbi Splansky points out that the brothers were served separately. Yosef was served separately. Is that correct?
Mhm.
I never checked the sources, and she claims that the reason for this goes way, way back to anti-Semitism and fear of Jews. Once they knew the brothers were Jews, they were separately seated. And I'm wondering if you could connect all those factors to going way, way back. I mean, we're talking about before Abduch Mitzrayim, before Yetziat Mitzrayim. We're talking way back. We saw the experience of anti-Semitism and attitudes toward Jews, whereas I always used to think the killing of Christ was what brought it on. Evidently, there's earlier evidence in our own Chumash to show the contrary.
That's possible. I mean, the hatred of Jews, I don't think is something that's necessarily Christian in origin, although there's a lot of studies that indicate how anti-Semitism was a factor perhaps in the spread of the hatred of Jews, and especially in the Shoah. And a lot of scholarly work, I think, connects Christian theology to some of that anti-Semitism. But I think that there's other indications there as well. And I think that that's a possible one of the motives, one of the reasons. I myself don't know enough about Egyptian culture and history to know whether the separation can only be attributed to anti-Semitism as opposed to the division between royalty and commoner and others. I mean, it might make sense to say that we wouldn't have the king or people representing the king simply having a dinner with, you know, guests who have come to the country, possibly. But I also think it's possible, you know.
Well, what I'm trying to really say is when they found out that Yosef was Jewish, if these were his brothers, could that also have been a reason that his respect diminished in Egypt?
Could be, but he never hid his historical background. Even when he was a slave in jail, the Torah calls him a Hebrew. He identifies himself as a Hebrew. He identified himself as the Hebrew coming from another country. So he was an immigrant. That's who he was. He was an immigrant. But beyond that, you know, some of the Forshim say something that's it's bold. But when you think about it, you can say, "Oh my goodness, I can see something forming here." Do you remember when Yosef became the viceroy and he saved Egypt? So he had a plan. He had an economic plan. But at some point, towards the end of the Parsha, Miketz, the Torah tells us that there came a point where people could no longer afford to buy food because they had become so poor. So do you remember what the Torah tells us, what Yosef had as an idea? Yosef had as an idea that all of you now become slaves to the king. So the entire population of Egypt was transformed into a slave class to the king. This was Yosef's idea. How interesting is it? How interesting is it that the Jewish people become slaves in Egypt? It's almost like he had put in place the foundation for what was going to happen. He had turned the entire Egyptian population into slaves, and it's almost like measure for measure. This is what you did to the people of Egypt, and now the people of Egypt are going to be doing this to you and your family.
But can I point out that he said that the Jews did not have to give up their land or anything. Only the Jews at the end of the Parshat Miketz were absolved from having to give up their land. So if anything, he created a situation where we were favored nation status
100%.
among the Egyptians.
Totally,
So
totally right.
naturally, all Egyptians are going to hate it. Only the Jews don't have to give up their land. Very nice.
But you know,
We're citizens and we have to give up our land, and these outsiders don't have to give up their land.
So that obviously causes more enmity, and that might again explain, if we buy this as a reasonable description, why was Yosef hesitant, one, to go home and to tell his father, and two, why did Yaakov have to force him to take an oath? Because Yosef's position may not have been entirely as secure as our Bible stories when we were younger made us believe. That there's a deeper level here, that there's a realpolitik that's going on in the country that we need to understand. And there's something also interesting. Do you remember when Yosef brought his family into Egypt? He had a plan. He said, I'm gonna have everybody live in a part of Egypt called Goshen, which apparently was considered to be a really good part of the country. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna separate you. Yosef himself was creating a self-imposed ghetto for the Jews. Keep us separate. We do not want to be victims of the onslaught of cultural assimilation. I want to keep my family protected and separate. Amazing. Okay, I understand that. Now let's jump ahead to our Seder. Let's jump ahead to Pesach. Okay, anybody remember why Pesach is called Pesach? What's Pesach? Why do we call Pesach Pesach? What does Pesach mean? It's called
Because he passed over.
passed over. Okay, so 1 second. So who passed over whom? What's that about? We say Hashem passed over what? The houses of the
Jews. And he
And
killed
what
all the firstborns of the Egyptians, and we were
Stop.
again.
So when you think of that description, isn't that a description of Jews and Egyptians living together?
Yeah.
That's
That
true.
the
They
name
have to
only
have the
makes
housing.
sense. The name only makes sense if the Jews no longer were living isolated in Goshen. It didn't make sense. You can't call the holiday Pesach because there's no jumping over. They're over there, and all
Right,
Egyptians-
if you had to mark your house so they knew it was you, not your neighbor,
then you have to assume that the neighbors
right,
are
that they were
already
living
there.
together.
Exactly.
Right, right.
So
Never thought
Yaakov's-
about that.
Exactly.
Yosef's plan at
When
some
they were,
point
when they
started
were-
to fall apart. At some point, it had to have fallen apart because otherwise, how could the Jews been living so close together? And do you remember as that whole story unfolded, and we'll get to this in Sefer Stuff. You remember when Hashem says, I want you guys, before you leave, I want you to go ask your Egyptian neighbors for gold and silver. Do you remember that part of the story?
Right.
What neighbors? If they're living in Goshen, there are no Egyptian neighbors. The only people that are living on your block are Jews. There are no neighbors. So
but
even
when they were slaves, they weren't only in Goshen, they were in all of Egypt. They were building all the structures. I know it's a false concept.
I get it. That's
people-
good, but then the language, Sharon, that the Torah should use is not isha me shchenta. Shchenta shachen shala. That's not a shachen. A shachen is somebody who dwells near you. If you're a servant, then you're asking your master or your employer, to use even a more genteel term. But the Torah is using a word which has a specific meaning, which would seem to be shachen. The point I'm making, though, really getting back to what you were suggesting, is that we're seeing here some sort of picture that's not the same, that the Jews were perhaps not so isolated, which means that they're coming much more into social contact with the Egyptians. And maybe, as you're saying a second ago, Doug, and you're saying, Sharon, that maybe the Egyptians are developing this strong antipathy to the Jews because they see them everywhere. Like, oh my God, they're everywhere. They're not even just in that part. Now they're living here and they're living there. And one of theirs is an immigrant, but he now sold a whole country into slavery. There's a lot of things bubbling up in the country, which might explain a little bit about what's going to happen as we move from Sefer Bereshit into Sefer Shemot, which is going to be exciting.
Rabbi, can I just briefly change the subject? In the rest of my week, which is in Tuesday, I get exposure to two very different philosophies of Chumash. One is I daven in a Chabad house, which takes a very fundamental view of Chumash and Torah. It says that everything is planned out in the beginning and everything is called plan. And in that world, if I can bring it back to today's share, God can, Joseph can cry on Benjamin's shoulder and see the Chorban. And Yaakov can see what's happening to Manasseh. On Sundays, I do a class with Rabbi Litek and Menachem Litek. And in that class, we try to really identify them more with. God makes changes in his plan all the time. I mean, he put the biggest thing is he says that when we were learning Sefer Devarim, Devarim was ready to go. He was ready to march into Israel, give Devarim right after marching Torah, and all of it would have been very different. But but then you have the Mubarak and all that has changed. Frankly, I see much more of Rabbi sexual than I did do with the idea of seeing centuries into history and prophesying that the temple is going to be destroyed, or they're going to be bad kings. And because this way it still leaves man with freedom of choice, which I believe he had.
That's a very good comment, Marty.
He's finished now.
Thanks, Sharon. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah talking about Nevuah and trying to deal with the philosophic problem of if God's knowledge is perfect, and his omniscience is can never be wrong, then everything that God sees, therefore, everything that God says would possibly always have to come true. And he talks about Nevuah. So do all Nevuahs have to come true? So all the Nevuahs that are for the betterment, he says do, but for the ones that are for destruction, he says not necessarily, because man does have the option for tshuva, and that response will change the forthcoming negative nevuah. So, what Yaakov sees in his sons, according to this midrash, that moment of foreseeing the destruction and the negativity that comes out of Ephraim and Manasseh, that's what he saw in the future. Does that mean it had to happen? I don't know. It's possible that history could always have taken a turn for the better, but it didn't. But is that because it's all foretold and man doesn't have a choice? Saadia Gaon in his Emunot V'Dayot tries to answer the question, and I know this is simplistic, but basically the point that Saadia Gaon is trying to say is knowledge is not causative. God's knowledge does not cause things to happen. So if you were standing at the top of a very large tower, as Saadia Gaon gives, and you can see 360 degrees around you, and you see two people who cannot see each other proceeding at right angles, you can see that a collision is going to happen, and it does happen, but you didn't cause it. You didn't cause it. You saw it, but you didn't cause it. So God's knowledge is perfect. Did Yaakov see the future? Did God give him a little bit of a taste of that sort of knowledge? Yes. So I think from my shiur, you probably have a sense that I see things more like Menachem Leibtag draws it out than the other side, where our avot are angelic characters whose midot we can never aspire to be like. I see it differently. It is a debate amongst within Jewish thought how to read the Tanakh in that sense. I understand the point that you're making, and not every Marty, not every midrash that Chazal say, not every midrash. Let me say it this way: there are contradictory midrashim. How's that possible? Because I think our Chachamim saw things differently for whatever reason. So if the Chachamim could offer us diametrically opposed midrashim, contradictory midrashim, I think that means that we can ask questions and we can say this one doesn't seem to work for me, whereas that one makes a lot more sense. I think it's definitely part of the way in which we can study Tanakh. And I enjoy studying with all of you and having a chance to share some ideas and questions. I don't know if every question has an answer, but I also think long time ago, I learned something in Yiddish, Mishtartnish Makasha. You don't die from a question. You have a question, okay, there are lots of questions in life, and not all of them we have answers to, but that's the beauty. I may not have an answer this year, but next year I might. Because between now and next year, I have a whole year's worth of things to learn. And who knows, maybe one of the things I'm going to learn is an answer to that question, or you might, and you can share it. So I'm going to wish everyone a good night. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being here.
Thank you very
Chazak,
much.
chazak, v'nit chazek. If you didn't finish your l'chaim, make sure you finish it before you go to bed. You will.
All the night.
Fine, good. That's good.
Night,
Nadia.
Rabbi.
That's exactly it. I agree. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
That
Nice.
was wonderful.
Good night.
Karen, it's me.